Rabbi Merrill Shapiro last spoke to this congregation in August on the state of religious freedom in Florida and the U.S. Rabbi Shapiro is the immediate past president of the National Board of Trustees of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Today, he puts on another hat and gives us a brief tour of the Garden of Eden. Though retired from the pulpit, Rabbi Shapiro still serves part-time the synagogues of Ormond Beach, Tallahassee, and Longwood. He is a past president of the Flagler County Democratic Club, and as a ham radio operator, has served as the public information officer for the Flagler Emergency Communications Association. He recently began his 7th year as a Bible teacher at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Palm Coast, where he lives with his wife of 49 years, Robin. They have 2 children and 5 grandchildren.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. I am flattered and honored to be asked, and really consider it a special gift to be able to speak with you. And I look forward to your input and your comments and your thoughts and ideas. I would normally, last time I joined you in August, I provided a photo of my wife and our 2 daughters who we raised for through their teenage years, and invited you to make me feel at home after having raised 2 teenage daughters by interrupting me while I speak. But I'm also told at the same time there'll be opportunity for us to chat afterward. But if you do want to interrupt me and speak, simply, I think you can unmute yourself and or wave your hand, and we'll try and do exactly that. This is me, and you are always welcome to be in touch. Your questions, comments, ideas are always welcome. And I believe this is being recorded, number 1. And number 2, some of you have these slides and can refer to them in the future. I'll take but a moment. The Garden of Eden does not appear until the 2nd chapter of Genesis, but it's worthwhile to spend a moment. The 1st chapter of Genesis is worthy of its own morning in and of itself. But you are familiar with the story. But if you're like me, well, I'm a sloppy reader, and I don't pay great attention to what I'm reading. In addition, voices from all around sometimes try to do the thinking. I allow them to do the thinking for me, when clearly the message from God is we all need to think for ourselves. We shouldn't listen to any pastor or preacher. I'll tell you, don't listen to me. Read these texts and see how they speak to you in that special and unique way. And that's much more important, really, than anything I have to say. And so I believe everyone's familiar with the 1st chapter of the book of Genesis. It is a poem. It is heavy in the language of metaphor, and was never meant to be taken as some kind of factual scientific dissertation on how the earth was created. There are those who believe that way, but they are in error, and it's really much more apparent. I'd be happy to help them if they were to read in not a translation, but were to read the text original. And so you know that it's in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and I'm just going to read what's on the screen. You don't really need me to read, but verse 2, the earth was without form and void, was chaotic. It is also a translation of the Hebrew tohu vavohu, without form and void, chaos, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. God said, let there be light. Notice we begin our service also by the lighting of the chalice, and God began creation with light as well. God saw the light, it was good. God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, darkness night, and evening and morning the first day. The use of the word he there in the 5th verse is because Hebrew it does not have a neutral gender like German does, for example. But later we're going to discover that God has no body. And since God has no body, God can't be a he or a she. In verse 6, God says, let there be a firmament, a big space in the midst of the waters. Let divide the waters from the waters. That's the waters below and the waters above. God made the firmament, divided the waters which are under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. It was so. So there's water above, like in clouds, water below, like on the face of the earth. God called the firmament heaven. Some say sky. Heaven is good. And the evening and the morning were the second day. Notice God did on the second day what God did on the first day. First day, God divided light from darkness. Second day, waters above from waters below. What happens the third day? Notice as well, on the second day, the third day, and through the course of this chapter, as in verse 8, there's evening and then morning, a second day. That is, the day begins with the evening. Days begin at sunset. And so in my Jewish tradition, the Sabbath begins on Friday evening. Passover begins in the evening. All of the festivals begin in the evening. The nights of Hanukkah herald in the next day. The evening comes first. Verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered into one place. Let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, the gathering together of the waters God called seas. God saw that it was good. God let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, fruit yielding tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in the earth, and it was so. And God brought forth grass, herb yielding seed after its kind, a tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning, a third day. So once again, God divides the waters from the land, just as God divided the waters above, the waters below. God divided light from darkness. God is putting the world into order. God is moving from chaos to order. And in verse 14, God says, let there be lights in the heavens, the firmament of heaven, to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs and seasons and days and years. God let them be for lights of the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. It was so. God made the two great lights, greater light for the day, that's the sun, lesser light from the moon, and so on. And God set them to give light upon the earth. I won't read it verbatim. To rule over the day and the dark, God saw it was good. Evening and morning, there were a fourth day. So God continues to put things in order. God creates days depending on the sun. By the way, notice that the sun is not created until the fourth day. There is no reason to believe that the first, second, third, and even the fourth days were 24 hours long. Without a sun, there was no such thing. They could each be a billion years. Sun created on the fourth day, and God continues to divide and put things in order. Although it's not found in this text, God continues after this text to say, while we're ordering the universe, God is going to create a universe in which force equals mass times acceleration. And that gravitational pull is going to be equal to a gravitational constant times the mass of one plus the mass of the other divided by the radius between them. Energy is going to be 1/2 the mass, kinetic energy is going to be 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. And energy is going to equal mass times the speed of light squared. And yes, all of those laws of physics were the continuation of God putting the world into order. On the fifth day, God says, let the waters bring forth abundantly every moving creature that hath life, fowl, and fly above the earth. God creates great whales, great sea monsters, and so on. God sees that it is good. God blesses them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters of the seas, let the fowl multiply, evening and morning. There were a fifth day. And then the sixth day, God said, let the earth bring forth a living creature after its kind, cattle, creeping thing, and so on. And in verse 25, God made the beasts of the earth after its kind, and the cattle after its kind, and everything that creepeth on it, and God saw it was good. Notice that at each creation, God says it is good. God never looks upon anything and sees that it's evil. God does not really create evil, and the notion of a devil, a Satan, a force for evil in the world is not found here in the book of Genesis, and is certainly not part of my Jewish tradition. Finally, God says in verse 26, let us make man in our image, and that us is a function of some Hebrew grammar, because here the word God is plural, and maybe a vestigial remnant of polytheistic days, but let us make God and man in our image, so that we are each of us in the image of God after our likeness, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over the earth, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. We have dominion over them. We are responsible for them, not to wipe them out, but to cultivate them and to cause them to grow and flourish as well. So God creates human beings in God's own image. The image of God created he them, and this is why I'm doing chapter 1. Male and female created he them. Men and women, women and men were created in the first chapter at the same time. And by the way, there's an argument here that perhaps God created human beings in such a way that they were both male and female. They were hermaphrodites. And only later do they become, male and female become separate. And as we'll see in the second chapter, strive to unite once again. In every female, there's an element of masculinity. In every male, there's an element of femininity. We're created together side by side. God blesses them. God says to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl, over everything that lives. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which the fruit of the tree yielding seed to you shall be for meat or for food. That is to say, God's intention is that we be vegetarians. We have no more, it is no more correct for us to kill animals and eat them than it is for animals to kill us and eat us. We are intended to be vegetarians. To every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, everything that creepeth upon the earth, where in life I've given green herb for food. And God saw everything that God had made, and behold, it was very good. Evening and morning, the sixth day. God never looks upon human beings, and this is the method of biblical authorship. God never looks at human beings and says they are good. Why? Because we have free will. Whether we are good or not is not up to God, but rather up to us. It is up to us whether to be good. However, the addition of human beings, as we see in verse 31, means that the world has changed from a place that is good to a place that is very good. That's our responsibility. And now we'll go to chapter 2. This is actually epilogue to chapter 1. The heavens and the earth were finished, the creation of the Sabbath, and so on in these first verses. And then we're going to come to the Garden of Eden, now to the subject matter. So chapter 2, verse 4. These are the generations, the heavens and the earth. They were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. So it's before there were plants. Notice in the first chapter, God creates everything, and finally human beings are the last creation. Here in the second chapter, human beings come first, and then a garden and plants are created. God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. There was no human being to till the ground either. A mist came up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God, as the quote that was used to introduce me, I appreciate it. The Lord God formed human beings of the dust of the ground. So pinch yourself, look at your skin, look at your eyes, look at your hair. All of it, eventually, if we trace it back, came out of the ground. It may have been that a cow or a goat or somebody ate it, and we ate the cow or the goat. We ate a plant that got its nourishment from the ground. In the end, we are, when you're feeling and you meet people who are arrogant, and I hope they are few and far between, remember they are of the dust of the earth. And then God breathed into the nostrils of human beings, in verse 7, the breath of life. and human beings, the human beings, and the Hebrew is Adam, so it's Adam, became a living soul. This is a critical understanding from the Bible, not read by our Bible banging friends, I'm afraid, that the soul enters the body, and thus a human being is created when there is respiration. This is a remarkable statement as far as abortion or women's reproductive rights are concerned. God breathes into the nostrils the breath of life. Unless there is respiration, it is not a human being. Abortion is not murder. Abortion is not a good thing, but it is certainly not the murder of a human being because that fetus has no soul. God breathes into the nostrils a soul, the breath of life, to become a living soul. And now more specifically to the Garden of Eden. Verse 8, the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there put the man, because only man is created at this time, the male, he had formed. Out of the ground, God made the Lord God to grow every tree, pleasant to sight, good of food, and the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now we're going to skip some geographical information about the rivers that emanate from Eden. I urge you to go back and look at chapter 2 of Genesis yourself. But the Lord God took put the man into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it, to cultivate it. So God didn't intend for human beings to sit around and do nothing. They had work to do. And the Lord God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou must freely eat. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For the day that thou eatest thereof, and the word day, once again, not necessarily 24 hours, that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. The death will become a feature of your life. And so where is the tree of good and evil? If we go back, where are we? Let's see. God puts the tree rested from him and forms the garden. And, okay, in verse 9, in the middle of the garden, God puts the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so man is not to eat of this tree. And I ask you, suppose you had cooked brownies and didn't want your family to eat it. You were saving it for some special occasion. You could take the brownies and hide them somewhere where your family couldn't find them. Or alternatively, you could put them in the middle of the dining room table, bring your family there and say, see these brownies, don't eat of them. Which is likely to be more effective? And there are those who would say, so why did, I think, and you can argue with me now if you'd like, in the chat, if nothing else. I think the best course would be, we'd agree, the best course would be to make the brownies and hide them away, someplace where your family couldn't find them. So does God, who does not want man to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, hide away the tree of good and evil? No, God puts it in the middle of the garden and says, here, look at this tree. See this? Don't eat of it. We might disagree. And so God said, it's not good for man to be alone. I think that's true even to this very day. I will make him a helpmeet for him. Out of the ground, God forms all of the animals to see what God calls him. And whatever Adam decided to call it. God may have had that long neck thing in mind calling it a bear, but Adam called it a giraffe, so Adam prevails. And it's called a giraffe even to this very day. So Adam gives names, and there's no suitable helpmeet equal for him. So the Lord God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. He slept. That God takes one of Adam's ribs, closes up the flesh, and of the rib which God had taken from man, God made woman and brought her unto man. So here's the creation of woman from, and you may have seen the poster or the needle point or something, not from the head to dominate, not from the feet to be trampled upon, but of the rib, of the side, to be man's equal. And Adam in verse 23 says, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This is called woman, because she was taken out of man. Verse 24 is most interesting. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. A man needs to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Interestingly, we should ask the question, what about a woman? Does she leave her mother and father? Does she cling to her husband? The answer in the chapter 2 seems not necessarily. A woman can stand on her own 2 feet, but a man has to be with his parents and then move on to his wife, because men need that companionship. Women do not. So I suggest you look back in your own experience, and even the next time you visit a cemetery, take a look and gather evidence as to the importance of chapter 2 in the book of Genesis, verse 24. I think we know, many of us from our own experience, it's not universal, but when a man dies after a long marriage, very often his widow goes on for years and years and years. But also when a woman dies after a marriage of many years and leaves behind a husband, the husband often dies in the first year to 18 months. Yeah, I was most recently reminded of this with Barbara Bush passed away and George H.W. passed away within a year. And there are many examples. I welcome you proving me wrong, but women, they call women the weaker sex, but women tend to women live longer, we know that. And without a man, they still continue on. But a man needs to have a woman in his life and does not last as long. And so must either cleave, must be part of his father and mother, or cleave unto his wife, and they're one flesh. So now they're both naked, and the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now the serpent is more subtle or cunning than any beast of the field. By the way, the idea that the serpent is a devil, the idea that there is a devil is a much, much later post-biblical invention, in fact. Figure of the devil as we understand it today. While Satan is mentioned in the book of Job, that Satan only operates with the permission of God. So God, the beginning of Job, Satan comes to God and asks for permission. Okay, I'm sorry, let's go back. So he said, the serpent says to, did God say you shouldn't eat of every tree of the garden? The woman and the serpent said, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. Verse 3, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And so how does woman know that? Woman was not created when God spoke to Adam to tell him those rules. She gets it from Adam. And notice her rule is a little more strict. Adam is told, you shall not eat it. In verse 3 there, Eve understands it as, neither shall ye touch it. But there was no rule from God that said, neither shall ye touch it. In verse 4, the woman says, nah, it's not true. It won't happen that way. God knows that when you eat of it, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. When woman saw the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she, Eve, took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Okay? Good thing to do, not a good thing to do. Okay? Wish we were all open and we could discuss this. Traditionally, this is evil. This results in what some traditions, I believe, erroneously call the fall of man, the fall of humanity. But actually, there's no fall here at all. And in fact, I'm going to attempt to demonstrate, hope that you will agree, but you can argue with me as well, that Eve is richly rewarded. Eve is richly rewarded for taking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So in verse 7, the eyes of them were opened and they knew they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together, made themselves aprons. King James, I think, says girdles. So anyway, verse 8, they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden of the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves in the presence of the Lord God amongst the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said, where are you? Where art thou? This is something fundamental about the condition of humanity. While we, in error, I believe, we in error continue to examine the nature of God, our understanding of the nature of God is not so important. What we think of God is not nearly as important as God's search for, in verse 9, God is searching for us. So what we think of God is not as important as what God thinks of us. God is searching for us. Even though it's natural for us to wonder about God, God is looking for us. So when great tragedies occur, COVID-19 befalls the world, and a million, what are we up to, 2 million deaths worldwide. 9/11, the Holocaust, whatever, slavery. We might say, where was God during these times? But God is saying, where were human beings? What did human beings do to master their own fates, to be in charge? Because they're the image of God here on earth. What were we doing? The question is not what was God doing, what were we doing? So in verse 10, Adam says, I heard the voice of the garden, I was afraid, I was naked, I hid myself. Verse 11, who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree that I commanded you, you should not eat? And the man, standing up straight, part of the spine, and shifts the blame and says, it was the woman who did it. Verse 12, she gave me the tree and I didn't. It's her fault, not mine. Dodges all responsibility. And for this, Adam and man do not get high grades. Let's put it that way. So in verse 13, God said to the woman, what have you done? And the woman said, I'm going to pass the blame as well. I'm not going to take responsibility. It's the serpent who beguiled me and I did eat. God does not give the serpent an opportunity to respond. By the way, the opening of the chapter said the serpent was a beast of the field. If you think of beasts of the fields, lions, tigers, bears, cows, giraffes, they all walk on 4 legs. But now in verse 14, God says to the serpent, because you have done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. From now on, you're not going to walk on 4 legs. Verse 14, upon your belly you shall go, and dust shall you eat all the days of your life. And so, and for those of you who have held snakes, by the way, we have a natural distaste for snakes, and that's in verse 15. I put enmity between me and the woman. Anybody who's held a snake, is it slimy and greasy? Not at all. And if you feel underneath the skin, you'll see the vestigial remnants of legs that don't develop, but are there in serpents and snakes. But there's enmity, so we don't like snakes, a little like Harrison Ford in all those movies, doesn't like snakes. So I put enmity between thee and the woman, thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise its heel. And now unto woman, God says, I will multiply your sorrow and thy conception. I put the original Hebrew at the bottom. I will multiply your pain and your anguish. In sorrow, you will give birth to children, and you shall desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, if you'll recall, I said when Eve took of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that she's rewarded. Does this sound like a reward? Not necessarily, but we need to read carefully. What exactly, and I'm uniquely unqualified, or I should say all the men who are here are uniquely unqualified to answer this question, but what does it mean, I will multiply your pain and your travail? What causes pain in childbirth? In the end, I would suggest, and again, I'm no expert, you can argue with me later, you can argue with me now, but lots of people argue with me all the time, that it's the contractions of the uterus necessary to, I don't want to use the word expel, to deliver a child through the birth canal. What's the biggest part of that child? The biggest part coming through the birth canal? The head. So notice, woman acquires knowledge through the eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And from that time on, we see, and anthropologists, the Leakey family is an example, discover that heads begin to grow. The Bible makes an association between pain in childbirth and the acquisition of knowledge. The acquisition of knowledge means a larger head to contain a larger brain. And so the reason there's pain in childbirth is because our children have larger heads. And so I would ask the parents here, or I would ask the mothers here, excuse me, would you opt for a reduction in the pain of childbirth so that you would get a child with 10 fewer IQ points when they were born? Or would you, in fact, like to have a child as smart as possible, who's therefore going to have a larger head to contain a larger brain and be that much wiser? And so it is, and by the way, this is not an original idea with me. It's the astronomer, scientist, pop scientist Carl Sagan pointed out the association of the acquisition of knowledge with pain in childbirth. The intermediary fact is that the acquisition of knowledge causes larger brains, greater wisdom, and more pain in childbirth. And so we go on, and verse 16 says, your desire shall be to your husband. God does not penalize women because their desire is to be to their husband. And by the way, we know vice versa as well. But this is the gift of sexuality, of sexual attraction, which in many religious traditions is an evil. But here, it's a gift. We recognize that sexuality and sexual desire is, in fact, a gift, not something evil. We don't have to have people born of a virgin birth or of immaculate conception. Sexuality and sexual behavior is a gift. And finally, and here I will admit I have much of an answer, he shall rule over you. That's the punishment for Eve, that man will rule over you, but that's because you're going to have to stay in one place and nurse children. And the human being, and the man, excuse me, will go out and hunt and find food. Hunter-gatherers will find food to sustain you, sustain women, sustain children, sustain the man himself. And so there's not a punishment here, but actually a reward. You're going to have smarter children. You're going to have sexual desire. That, in fact, is a gift that Eve gets. But it doesn't stop there. Because God turns to Adam and says, because you have hearkened unto the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, thou shalt not eat it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and dust thou shalt return. Adam, life is going to be hard. You're going to have to work. In the Garden of Eden, you could reach up, take a cluster of grapes, peel a grape, eat it. There's fruit, there's vegetables, you had everything you wanted. Now you're going to have to go out and get a job. You're going to have to work. But at the same time, you're going to have to achieve. You're going to have to strive to do better. It's not going to be easy. But when you prevail, you will have a sense of satisfaction like no other. Work is tough. You have to go out and do it. By the way, in modern times, with ever greater numbers of children returning to live with their parents after they graduate with bachelor's degrees and sometimes master and doctorate degrees, coming back to live with parents, parents as well need to tell their children, get up and get out and get a job. Yeah, it's hard. In sorrow, you're going to eat bread. By the sweat of your brow, you're going to sustain yourself. But you have to get up and work, because otherwise you'll not know the sense of achievement that can be accomplished through work, through effort, through setting a goal and working methodically to achieve that goal. So from the sweat of thy face, you will eat bread, but the bread will taste that much sweeter because you earned it. Did it the old-fashioned way. You worked hard and you earned it. And now notice in verse 19, God is talking to Adam. Look at verse 17. It says, to Adam, God is talking. Excuse me. In verse 19, in the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. And then God leaves off. And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. That Adam also and his wife did the Lord made coats of skins and clothed them. So God makes a gift for them, and God clothes human beings. And then God has noticed that now man has become as one of us, a little godlike, knowing good and evil. He might take of the tree of life and eat and live for it forever. And so God sends them out of the Garden of Eden and drives them so you can never return to the Garden of Eden. We can never return to that cushy life where everything's given to us and we don't have to do anything. We have to work for it. And so we've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, as well we should be. We can make it on our own. So what happens to Adam? In verse 19, here on the screen, sweat of thy face, thy brow, you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. Dust you are, and from dust you shall return. Adam discovers he is going to die. His children, grandchildren, are going to die. But what about Eve? Is there mentioned any place that Eve dies? No, this is only to Adam. Eve does not die. And in fact, women do not know death. Women instead have children. And so women live on forever. Adam is punished to a certain degree, if you regard it as a punishment, but we shouldn't live forever anyway. I don't know that it's necessarily a punishment, but Eve is rewarded because Eve reached up, and don't forget the name of that tree, and took of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That Eve, in fact, women, in fact, introduced knowledge into human society, and therefore are rewarded with smarter children. We're all rewarded with the gift of sexuality, and Eve and all of her female offspring are rewarded by being given the gift of the ability to have children and through them to live forever. And so it's not yet Mother's Day, but Mother's Day will come. But you don't have to wait till Mother's Day. Think about your mother and the gift that she gave and the role that women play in our life. Women have been subjugated too long. Traditional religious leaders read these texts and say, women are the source of all evil. They introduce evil into the world by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But in fact, women bring knowledge and bring good into the world and are rewarded. So may the women and so may the men who have joined us this morning be richly rewarded throughout their lives as well. And I thank you very much for taking your time and being most generous with your attention. I welcome your comments later. Thank you.